Hi guys. Kind of single screening tonight, so apologies in advance. And for those of you who are just joining us, tonight's footage is going to strictly be discussion of the underlying systems for Dwarf Fortress. We're not actually going to start playing as such. Uh, I'll take you through the file structure, how tags and modding works. I'll show you what settings I modify as part of my inits and my raw changes. We'll install a graphics tile set as part of the lazy the starter pack. We'll go on through to World Gen, and later on I'll post the World Gen seed I'm using for tomorrow's stream. I'll cover how Advanced World Gen works in general, link you to the resources on the wiki where you can go into more depth if you want to further customize it. You should recognize that some of the things I'm going to talk about are really merely introductions to the topic. I'm not going to have time to cover every conceivable modification you could make to your raw files, for example, but I will be able to kind of discuss it in general. Um, we'll go on through Embark. I'll create an Embark profile. We'll actually embark, and I'll spend a little bit of time with the game on pause when we first embark, setting up custom professions and therapists. And at the end of the evening, what I'll do is I'll bundle up the World Gen seed we use, the information on where we embarked, uh, the embark profile we used when we embarked, and the custom professions I'm using for Dwarf Therapist. And then at that point, you can download the starter pack for yourself, install those 3 items, and I'll show you how to do that, and then go to town, and you can basically replicate the exact scenario I'm using. So not only will you have the ability to follow along with me playing through it live, you'll have an opportunity to replicate or improve on what I've done in the same location if you like. Now, all of this is being done as part of a charitable effort, and I kind of need to mention, if you scroll down below the video there, you're going to see a lot of links to Extra Life, which is a charitable drive that we're on right now for a local children's hospital, Riley Children's Hospital here in Indiana. And all the donations that we raise as part of this event go directly to the hospital, and none of it's being collected by me, which is the only reason why I'm accepting donations of any sort. Um, if you like what we're doing, if you'd like to see more of it, go ahead and consider kicking in a donation for the kids. Um, that's pretty much the whole of it. So we'll broadcast tonight probably for an hour or two while I get things set up, maybe 3 hours. And then I'll knock off, I'll hit the hay early, and tomorrow I'll make the best stab I can at getting through 24 hours straight of Dwarf Fortress. You're all welcome to tune back in for that at that point. Now, before I get underway, does anybody have anything that they'd like to see, not related to actually playing the game, but in terms of how they get the game set up, or how to set up the various tools that they want to use? Any specific questions? Not scheduled to start for a couple more minutes yet, so sign up for what? For the charity? The links are actually right below the video if you scroll down. Yeah, I'll be covering World Gen settings in specific places. I'll go into depth, but I'll be covering the Advanced World Gen in general, and I'll be describing how the various changes will, in general, affect your world. I'll introduce Perfect World, but you have to keep in mind I don't work with Perfect World, so I can't really help you in terms of how to get it to do exactly what you want. I'll discuss it in very brief, but it's in a more advanced tool for World Gen on top of what we're going to cover tonight. Oh, sorry, man. All right, let's go ahead and get underway. All right, when you install Dwarf Fortress from the starter pack in whatever location you pick, it's going to have. Yep, I'll discuss it. Perfect World is an advanced utility that basically will allow you to literally dictate the actual terrain of your world. You could use it to replicate basically any terrain you can conceive, pretty much. Um, there's probably limits, but if you mean the setting of the range in World Gen, we'll be covering that when I get to the Advanced World Gen section. Perfect World is basically a tool that you can use to literally dictate the exact terrain of your world. I mean, you could take a topographical map, for example, scan it and make an image of it under certain shadings, and then reuse it for uh, the topographical map of your world, and you'd literally have an image of it. I mean, it's not perfect, but close. All right, now underneath Dwarf Fortress, you're going to find several folders here. Stone Sense is where that particular utility is. That allows you a three-dimensional view of your current area in the game. The data folder will contain your saves, movies played by the game, scripts. The announcements are things that occur in certain points of the game. Sounds used by the game. There's not very many actually in the vanilla game. We'll be using Sound Sense when we actually play, so I'll go through how that's getting set up. No, I didn't have a chance to mess with it this week to try and figure out how to place a volcano. So I borrowed a map from the DF World Gen thread out on the Bay 12 forums, and we'll be reusing it. I've modified it a little bit from its original, and then tested it as an embark just as far as actually embarking on it to see what the site would be like, and it looked good, so we'll go with it. Yeah, Perfect World literally would allow you to do a geographically correct world map if you wanted. I know there's limits to what it can produce. I don't know what those limits are, and they're not very strict. Now, inits are things that Dwarf Fortress initializes when it starts. dinit and init are files we'll modify a little bit later on. WorldGen is the file in which you will install the WorldGen seed that I'll provide. Now, in each of these files, what you're going to see when you open them is really just a collection of tags. And each thing you see here, WorldGen, surrounded by these little brackets, title, large island, these are tags. This is the WorldGen tag, this is the title tag, and so on and so forth. And each of these corresponds to a setting that we'll see in a moment in Advanced World Gen. So sharing these allows you to share an identical copy of the settings you use when you create a particular environment. So when we modify ours, we'll actually have this world gen seed right down here at the bottom. This one right here will be what we use. Now, changes in these you could make directly here, but it's probably not a good idea. You can modify these directly in the game. However, a lot of these other things in the init files, for example, are things that maybe you can't change once you've got the game open. So, for example, print mode is set to text will be text, and I'll cover how to change that through the through the starter pack launcher in a moment. But controlling your graphics is something you actually have to do before you actually start the game. So even if you're messing around with the vanilla game and you're not going to make any changes whatsoever, you're going to have to know how this works if you want to make changes to print mode in terms of how your graphics work, alter your frame rate cap, or modify how the game is going to uh, take priority on your processor. So all of these are things I'm going to show you how I set in the starter pack launcher. Likewise, over here in DNit, there's some settings specifically for dwarf mode. How often your game will save, whether certain game features are enabled, um, features that modify how dwarves handle storage, colors and tiles, and all sorts of things to modify. I'll try to go through everything I modify. There are quite a few that I change from the vanilla, and I'll do my best to kind of run through what they are. The announcements file is the last one I really want to touch on. This controls how certain game events will play out. So, for example, we're going to modify a couple of them here. Dig cancel warm and dig cancel damp correspond to whether your dwarves cancel the job that they're digging if they detect that there's suddenly damp stuff. So now it's incumbent upon me not to dig into the side of an ocean or not to dig into the side of a river, but they'll cancel the job regardless. I can't control whether they'll cancel it. All I can control is whether it pauses the game and recenters my camera, or whether I get an announcement at all. So what I can do is I can delete the P and the R in this tag, and that takes out the pause and the recenter. So now when my dwarves dig alongside a river, it'll cancel the dig job, but it won't pause my game and jerk my camera and force me to look at that exact square. Instead, I'll start getting cancellation notifications, and I can go and look at it in my own time. That way, if I'm doing something else, or I'm trying to watch something going on like a siege, I'm not having sudden focus loss because I'm looking in a different direction. Likewise, dig warm, we're going to do the same thing. This doesn't change that it cancels the digging job. It just removes the pause and the recenter so that I don't have that annoyance. Now, when you're modifying these, you want to make sure you're doing it with you want to make sure you're doing it with like Notepad. You don't want to be modifying with Word and saving it as a Word document. It still has to keep its text extension. You don't want to be modifying the extension of the files. You can go in and modify them with Notepad. That works just fine. None of them are particularly big. However, now we get to move on to the RAWs. Outside the data folder, there's a folder for RAWs, and RAWs are everything that you interact with in Dwarf Fortress. They're your dwarves. They're the bins that they store things in, the plants they grow, the animals they kill, the goblins they fight, and everything about those entities, their civilizations, all of their items and equipment and workshops and knowledge base, basically, is stored in the raw files. And just like the inits, they operate on a system of tags. In the objects folder, for example, there are tags that correspond to everything in the game. So, for example, inorganic metal is literally the properties of iron, the properties of gold, the properties of silver and copper, and so on. How they're described in the game when they're in various states. when they boil or melt. So that will determine whether they're magma safe, for example, and whether you can use them in constructions that may contact high temperatures. How they handle in terms of weapons is literally controlled in terms of their scientific properties, impact yield, fracture, strain. All of these things are literally the material properties of copper as they pertain to Dwarf Fortress. This determines whether iron is better at being a weapon, for example, than steel. So you could modify these and you could reverse that if you wanted by changing these tags. Now I leave the details of that kind of vague intentionally. We're not going to modify most of these things tonight. I'm just showing you how they work. Now, in particular, there are a couple I want to touch on. Inorganic stone layer, inorganic other, I think is just plasters. I'm looking for inorganic stone soil. There it is, right there. This is all of the soil materials in the game, and you'll notice that some of them have the aquifer tag has been kind of malformed. We turn aquifers off for this. I don't actually know whether this Embark has aquifers or not. It might very well if you leave them on. I'll show you how I disable them through the starter kit, but I do want to touch on a couple of things I've done when I was first starting out to make my life a little easier when I was learning how to play. In particular, there's a tag attached to each of the clay and sand materials. So here's an example of something you can modify fairly quickly and easily that changes how the game will play. You'll notice that most of the clays say ceramic earthenware, and so on and so forth. But down here at the bottom, this guy made out of fire clay, he says ceramic stoneware. Turns out stoneware works differently in the game, but the gist of it is that you could take this tag, copy it, move it up here, and replace this tag, and suddenly when you process clay, you would get stoneware instead of earthenware. That would change how your values work. It would modify what you got out of the reaction when you processed your clay, and it would allow you to literally make everything into stoneware and not have to deal with the glazing process if you wanted. I've changed various types of ore into iron so that I had iron on sites that otherwise wouldn't have any. I've modified all my soils to be both sand and clay so that I could have both on a site that didn't have one or the other or either. All of those things are controlled here, and there are far, far too many for me to go into the details of each one. If you're interested, there are all kinds of overhauls like Masterwork that modify how the game plays by either adding civilizations and entities to challenge you if you feel like you've learned enough in the vanilla game, or to alter how the game works in terms of maybe reducing some of the clutter variety when you have to worry about whether something is made out of cat leather or dog leather or cow leather. Yep, I've made sand and clay the same thing before. I don't know if I've done it on stream. I did it at one point when I was learning, I know. I made cobaltite into iron so that I had and cobaltite is an ore of cobalt, not iron. I made cinnabar into iron so that, that's an ore of mercury. Because I wanted to have iron on a site that didn't have it, and I was just messing around. You could make things into coal that weren't. You could change the properties of basic stones into adamantine if you wanted. The limits are really just however you modify it. Now, I do need to caution you, modifying the tags in your raws can produce all kinds of bizarre behavior and render your game basically unplayable. So back up a copy before you start tweaking. But that literally allows you to customize Dwarf Fortress right down to the nth degree. And things that can't be modified in Dwarf Fortress through its tags are often modified in DFHack. And some of the tools I'll touch on as we play are things that are added by DFHack, and DFHack's included in the starter kit. It allows you to modify the game state in various ways, and I'll touch on what I'm doing as I do it, so I'll let you know whether it's part of the vanilla functionality or something that I'm doing with DFHack, so that you'll know whether you'll have that particular feature in the base game or whether you'll have to have DFHack installed. So let's go ahead and jump into the starter kit, and I'll start the starter pack up here. All right. And this large series of buttons allows me to change various game state things that are controlled with the init file. So, for example, this tells Dwarf Fortress what I want my population cap to be before I stop getting migration waves. Now, that's not a hard cap. I could conceivably get a wave while I still had 148 people, and it could be 80 people, and it would be, well beyond this cap. And the game would certainly allow me to do that. If I want to absolutely hard limit the number of dwarves I have, that's the strict population cap here. That's a new feature with version 40. I do change my child cap. The basic game is pretty much unlimited. You can have up to 100 children by default. The percentage of your dwarven population is something like 1,000, so the only limit is the hard cap of 100 kids, which basically means you could have a fortress of 5 dwarves and have a insane migrant wave with 30 kids and 3 dwarves. At which point, if you don't already have food, you starve to death. We'll leave invaders on, we'll leave cave-ins on. I'll discuss how those work as we play. Temperature determines whether magma will burn things, so you want to be careful when you turn that off. It determines whether water will freeze if it's left out in the open on glaciers, so that's a significant effect. Weather determines whether there's rain and snow and so forth. You can turn those things off for a frame rate boost if you're really suffering in terms of how fast the game is running. Dwarf Fortress, despite its graphical simplicity, is a very, very complicated game behind the scenes. It's got a lot of detail, so when you start to think about all the things it's running, turning some of them off actually will improve that, but it will affect how your game works. Artifacts, or whether or not your dwarves will have moods, I'd always leave that on. I turn pet entombment off. If I want to entomb a particular pet, I will do so, but otherwise, onto the refuse pile with them. I'll make my dwarves happy in other ways besides burying their pets and eating up my coffins. Liquid depth allows me to determine whether a particular patch of water will drown a dwarf or simply allow him to wade. I don't like turning children off. I do like some realism. I just kind of like to have a little bit of control on how it plays. The basic settings, once this moved to version 40, I've seen people reporting migrant waves where they have 10 migrants and 60 kids, insane numbers of children that just eat them out of house and home. It's based on how World Gen works, and so it's possible to have a particularly fecund group of dwarves who just immigrate with their whole family and swamp you, potentially even early on. But children can grow up into adults, so I don't like eliminating them. That does mean that I have to deal with certain consequences, like the potential for female soldiers to give birth mid-battle, because dwarves don't take off if they're pregnant. You gotta worry about, woodcutter who's carrying her baby, and she goes out to cut wood, and there's a goblin snatcher that steals the baby right out of her arms and runs off. You've got to be aware of that possibility. Borderlands pre-sequel is kind of like playing Borderlands 2. And I mean that in both the good and the bad way. If you liked Borderlands 2, you'll probably like Borderlands the pre-sequel. If you don't, you're probably not going to like it. It's not that different of a game from its predecessor. They've added some new mechanics. They've changed a few things. You can play as Claptrap. That it's not a Borderlands 2 DLC like some people are reporting. It has changed, but I don't know that it's a significantly different experience. If you didn't like the previous versions, you're definitely not going to like this one any better. Now, on with Dwarf Fortress. Okay, now I don't modify the Embark profiles, but you can certainly add your own at some point if you wanted. I don't modify the key bindings. I take what we've got. Graphics, I install the Phoebus tile set, and I set text will be text. This allows me to see multiple Z levels at once. That's not a vanilla feature. the Phoebus tile set does modify your files a little bit. So before you change all of these settings here on the front page, go in here and set up your tile set and your print mode and get all these things set up, because then once you come back out here, some of these will have changed, and you'll want to make sure that you get these set the way you like them. Now, under utilities, I use these. These are tools that are included with the starter pack. They are updated separately. They are their own separate projects that are bundled up in the starter pack as a service to Dwarf Fortress players. These are very common things for people to be using for one reason or another. And I won't go into all of them. I don't use all of them, but I will touch on several that I personally use. Dwarf Therapist we will use extensively. It's used for controlling my dwarves' labors. I'll use it for assigning dwarves into military squads. It basically allows me to perform certain functions that I would otherwise perform through the game's default native interface, but do so with a modern mouse-driven spreadsheet-like presentation that's not present in the original game. To make the same sorts of changes I will make using Dwarf Therapist in a couple of clicks, I would have to go in and out of menus on 20 dwarves, 3 levels deep, setting various labors and unsetting others multiple times per dwarf. And, look, I played EverQuest. I don't need another invitation to carpal tunnel syndrome, thanks. So, basically, I pretty much don't play the vanilla game until Dwarf Therapist is out. I'll play without a tile set briefly if I have to. I'll play without DF Hack until it gets updated after a new version. I don't play without Dwarf Therapist. It just doesn't happen. It's that important to how I play. And I'll show you why once we get into the actual game footage. But you'll see some of that tonight as I go into custom professions, because Dwarf Therapist is where we'll set those up. Legends Viewer allows you to see the history of your world in detail, and I'll touch on that briefly when we generate our world. I'll touch on Legends mode from within the game. Legends Viewer is effectively an external utility that you can use to read through and export of that information. If you want to research the history of the dwarf king who just arrived at your kingdom, for example, and determine for yourself his personal history, you can actually read it there. Perfect World is what I was discussing earlier. Perfect World DF allows you to modify the topographical and rainfall patterns in your world. It allows you to modify where the magma is, set where your volcanoes appear. It's an incredibly powerful tool that I just don't understand, I'm afraid. So, QuickFort we'll actually export a bedroom pattern, and someone told me recently that there's actually an exploratory mining pattern in there that I have to go and tinker with a little bit. So I'll show you how that allows me to automate some of the process of digging out particular patterns. This allows you to save floor plans, for example, and modify them or change them to your tastes. So there's actually a set of floor plans included that we'll actually use for digging out our bedrooms. SoundSense we'll touch on briefly, but basically anytime you hear music or sound effects in the game, pretty much, it's going to be coming from SoundSense and its pack, and I'll show you how it works. Basically, it'll monitor the game log for us, and as certain events occur, it'll play sounds according to that. It makes it easier to track what's going on in your fortress by sound. It's not until you play the vanilla game and you realize how few sounds there really are, and how quiet the game really is, that you come to really truly appreciate how much information you can get while multitasking based on the sounds that are being played to your ears while you're watching or reading something else. Those of you who've played, first-person shooters, for example, are going to fully appreciate the ability to be able to hear things that are going on while you're looking at something else, and SoundSense allows us that ability. It doesn't modify the game in any way. It just reads the game log and plays sound events for us. So we'll use it to kind of liven up our fortress a little bit, and also give us some background music occasionally as seasons change and so forth while we're playing. Now, under these advanced settings, these are things on how your game is saved. I like seasonal autosaves in case something goes terribly, drastically, horribly wrong. I can always go back and load a previous season save. And that also applies whether your game gets corrupted, for example, or if you encounter some unwinnable condition in your opinion, you could always go back to a previous save and have a chance to kind of prepare for it a season out. Now,
in addition to that, it'll determine whether the game will pause when it saves. I like to turn that on because the saving process isn't exactly short. And if I get up to go walk away and grab a soda while it's working, I don't want the game to be running away when I come back. I set the backup saves on so that my saves spread out. Basically, this renames them and allows me to keep them separate so that I can go back theoretically through the entire history of my fort and load a particular point in time, a particular season if I want, and I could continue progress theoretically from any point along the way within my fortress. Pause on load allows me to start loading the world, walk away, and come back and have the game waiting. Initial save means I get a save game as soon as I actually arrive at a site. So if I want to keep a pristine copy of my environment, the initial save will give me that. Compress saves turns on the compression for save games, and as this says, I would keep this on unless you really experience some sort of real problem. Opening the save game folder will allow you to modify, alter whether you have those save games or not. So, for example, here's the quick test embark I was making the other day. We'll create a new one of this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this anyway, so we're not worried about it. Okay, processor priority. Dwarf Fortress is a single core process. Unless you have a single core, setting this up a bit is not going to hurt anything. It basically allows Dwarf Fortress to get a bigger share of the resources of the core it's running on, more or less. Unless you have a single core, setting it higher is not going to affect anything because your operating system, for example, is going to run on a different core. Your other utilities are going to run on different cores. Dwarf Fortress is not a multi-core utility, so it's not going to get the advantage of that. It's only going to run on one. Lastly, under these tabs is DF Hack. Workflow, I'll cover in great depth. That's what Cherubin was asking about earlier when I couldn't quite understand the question that he's asking. Workflow will allow us to set production targets in an intelligent fashion that improves upon the base game. For example, I can tell them I want to maintain between 100 and 200 roasts. And basically, that sets it up to have kind of a little bit of automation. The game will turn on a job when it needs to, it will turn it off when I have enough, and allows me to maintain a particular range of stockpile that I can change on the fly or set as I like. Now, you can do that in the game, but it requires you to literally monitor the stocks like a hawk and then queue up manager jobs that can only be queued up to 30 at a time. So you have to queue 30 and then queue another 30 and then queue another 30 because you can't queue 200. You'd have to queue 36 times and then queue 20 separate. And workflow will kind of allow us to circumvent that limitation in an intelligent fashion and focus our attention more on actually playing the game and less on being an automaton. I like changes that allow me to mitigate some of the micromanagement that Dwarf Fortress is kind of famous for. It's kind of built in. But workflow allows me to get around a large chunk of it and really focus on how your fortress is playing rather than trying to constantly leave the game on pause and constantly evaluate your production levels of various items. These other automation plugins, Auto Nest Box and Seed Watch, I'll use Seed Watch. I don't know that we'll touch on Auto Nest Box until much, much later in the stream, if at all. The others I generally leave off. Performance tweaks allow me to clean the map, for example. I do leave that vanilla generally. If I need to run those, I'll run them manually. Bug fixes, I'm not sure if this is working. Last time I checked, it wasn't. I haven't looked to see if it's fixed in the current version. Fix feeding prisoners and stuck doors. If I get to the point where I have prisoners I have to feed or stuck doors, we'll kind of monitor them, and if necessary, I'll do those things as I need. Automatic job assignments. Auto labor literally replaces therapist, but it runs into an issue where it takes my control away, and I'm afraid I'm a little too much of a control freak to actually let the program manage my dwarves for me. Maybe that's because I don't want to go completely hands off and just run my fortress as a remote spreadsheet. But I really don't like having the game decide for me that somebody's going to be doing something, because a lot of times I like to specialize who is doing a particular labor exclusively, and auto labor kind of prevents me from doing that to an extent. Uh, version 40.13 is fairly stable. I haven't run into a lot of bugs. There are some. It's still Dwarf Fortress. There will be bugs probably well after I have stopped video gaming when I'm 95. There's typically what'll happen is when they do a major release like version 40, the first few releases are just crash prone as all get out. That's just the way Dwarf Fortress is when it first launches a new version. But by this point, 40.13 is stable. There's no corruption issues that are being reported. There's some oddities in terms of how things are working that may not be how they'll work in the final game, 20 years from now when Toady finishes. But they'll sit the way they are. They're playable as is. And so I'll try to touch on behavior if I notice something that I think is probably a bug. I'll try to point it out. But chances are good that we'll play through a long time before we hit anything that's actually a bug, if at all. There are certain things I'll work around out of habit, for example, that may be bugs that are already fixed, and I didn't catch the fix message, if you will. Version 67. No, the way Toady rates his versions is a little different than what you're expecting. Version 40 basically means Toady feels that he's 40% done adding all of the features that he wants to have for his initial release. 1.0 is effectively feature complete. Not, mind you, feature balanced, but feature complete. So theoretically, Dwarf Fortress is 40% done as of this version, and the minor version, what would be a minor version elsewhere, is literally just a revision tag, if you will. So this is the 13th release of version 40, the 40% version. So he's done some bug fixing along the way to get to this point. In fact, right now he's gone back to the workbench to add some of the features that he had planned for version 40 that didn't make it into the final release. So he's adding fruit trees and how they get harvested in a version that's probably going to come out while I'm broadcasting this, the way he was describing it. So I've donated to Bay 12 Games. I have. And you should too if you like Dwarf Fortress. Toady, the programmer for the game, Tarn, lives off your donations. That's literally his job. He codes Dwarf Fortress. That's his sole calling, his magnum opus. There's a few bugs that I don't think have been addressed. For example, when we cover setting up archery dwarves, I'll discuss why I don't keep all my bolts in bins. I keep most of them in bins because it's a convenient way to store them, but I'll have a stockpile that does not have bins to work around a bug. I'll try to touch on some where I think that the behavior is something you need to be aware of, that you may be able to play with, you may be able to mitigate, but there's potential negative effects that you need to be cognizant of before you indulge in some sort of feature or behavior. All right. Now, that's pretty much it, except that down here at the bottom is the init editor, and this allows you to modify your init files. We kind of touched on these earlier. You can open them with Notepad and modify them that way, just like any of the other things. And some of these things are things that you saw that I set with the buttons rather than modifying them directly. But there's a few things in here that I often change for my personal benefit or because I like to, that you may want to change for yourself. For example, I turn map rejects logging on because if the world generator rejects one of my worlds, it would tell me why in a log file so that I can examine if I've maybe set my ranges in such a way that the world can't possibly be created. If, for example, I set the max elevation to 3, there's no mountains in the world because everything's ocean. So it just sits there and generates world after world and it just throws them all out because everything's all ocean because I've set my settings wrong. And the log file will tell me that. The embark rectangle is the default size that we'll have on our map when we embark, and I'll touch on that when we actually get to the embarking phase. The default is 3x3, and I'll set 5x5 by default because that's as big as I'm willing to go on my map, and I can always go smaller if I want, if features are close together, for example. I alter the path costs a little bit, making the normal, high, and restricted ranges a little higher than they are by default, but not vastly so. You'll notice that these are kind of going up by a factor of 3 each time. That gives them a sort of consistency between one another. That's all I do it for. It's a little bit OCD. It does make your restricted tiles a little more effective. It makes your normal tile, or it makes the preference for high tiles a little stronger if you have high traffic tiles. We'll cover traffic designations midstream. Here's the population caps and child caps, and the description of what these actually do is right above them. So, for example, I've changed this so that I have a hard cap of no more than 50 kids in my fortress at once, and no more than 30% of my fortress's children at one time. So that will stop kids from being born effectively until I have enough adults to push the percentage down. It will also stop kids from being born if we have at least 50 of them. So if we get to 150 dwarves and 30% of my dwarves are children, then that's also 50. So these are basically the same limit for me at maximum population. You can control the percentage down lower, for example, and set the cap higher, but keep in mind the lower number is used as the cap. So depending on where you are, that's going to control. 30% of 7 dwarves is a lot lower than 50 dwarves. So you could set this high and use the cap to control a hard cap, but not have any control over what percentage of your fort that was, or you can reverse it and set a percentage that will grow with your fort. In this case, at max population, they'll be the same, but early on, it will kind of restrict the number of kids that I have to deal with. The difference between Dwarf Fortress and Minecraft code, I'm not sure I'd want to see either one from what I've heard. Now, a couple of things in here affect only Adventurer mode, and I won't really go into depth in Adventurer mode. If you're looking to play a roguelike and you want to play Dwarf Fortress as a roguelike, that's what Adventure mode is for. But I'll be honest, it's not really my cup of tea, and I've played it a few times, and I stay away. So if you're looking for an Adventure mode tutorial, we won't really cover it. Adventure mode allows you to jump into the body of a human, dwarf, or elf and literally play in the world as though you were an adventurer. Go off and pillage goblin strongholds by yourself, invite townsfolk and city guards to accompany you on your quest, slay night creatures, and be set upon in the dark by boogeymen. All of those things are in the adventure mode, and it has, kind of a top-down, old-school, roguelike feel to it. It has the same sort of combat that you'll see at a distance in dwarf mode right built in. You'll get to determine where you want to aim that axe and how you're dodging and dealing with all of your social contacts. Yeah, I don't play adventure mode. Toadie's changes recently have been significantly to affect how adventure mode will play in the world. And that's probably going to continue for the near future. And I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not my particular cup of tea, and that's not what I'm going to be covering on stream. So I'll touch on it briefly in terms of what it is, and then we'll kind of move on past it because it's not relevant to us, at least not for this stream. There are people out there who show adventure mode on camera, and I'm sure you can find one if you really are interested. But you can always just jump right in and go off and gallivant and adventure and die horribly, because that's the spirit of Dwarf Fortress, isn't it? I'll set, that I have a frame rate counter. I've modified my frame rate caps, I think. One thing that I will change for certain is I set the macro milliseconds down to 0. That's for the benefit of Quick Fort. So that's a setting that Quick Fort will actually warn you about if you have it set too high, higher than 0. Then Quick Fort will actually warn you. This controls how quickly an instruction from a macro can replay, and Quick Fort complains if it's set too high because it potentially causes Quick Fort to miss an instruction and screw up the blueprints it's trying to print out. Yeah, I'm not saying it's bad, but personally, if I'm playing a roguelike, I'm probably playing Angband. I'm not playing, or I'm playing Rogue Legacy. I'm not playing Dwarf Fortress: The Adventure mode. dwarf mode, fortress mode, scratches the roguelike on a large scale itch for me. Playing a fortress is its own sort of roguelike. SimCity as a roguelike, maybe even. Yeah, Taj Mahal, maybe. I haven't played that one. I've been looking at it and thinking maybe I'd like to, because if I'm not mistaken, that actually grew out of Angband originally. All right, so we've talked inits. We've discussed how mods work in general, how they modify the raw files. We've changed a couple of settings in our inits for our convenience later on. We've set our inits and buttons. I've kind of scrolled through them. Anything I didn't touch on in depth, you can always scroll back and kind of see how I have it set, so you have it exactly the way I do. I'll be exporting the world gen seed we'll use, and let's get started on actually seeing the game here. So we'll start Dwarf Fortress, and then right away, what'll happen, because I've got them turned on, is all these utilities will immediately start up for me. Here's Dwarf Fortress, there's Dwarf Therapist, here's Sound Sense. All of these windows, just start popping up out of nowhere. Don't panic, it's not as bad as it looks. We'll minimize the starter pack if we need to use it. It'll be right there for us later. We'll expand Dwarf Fortress and then minimize it for later. Get Sound Sense expanded and minimized for later, and we'll do that pretty much with all of these windows here, just so that they're ready for us later. Dwarf Therapist is looking for our game to be playing, and it's not, so we just hit OK and move on. We'll be touching all of these things in a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and sort my icons a little bit here, just for my sanity, because both of these are Sound Sense. This is Dwarf Therapist, and this is Dwarf Fortress. Now, Dwarf Fortress will actually start two windows if you're using the starter kit with current version, because one of those windows is actually DF Hack. You'll notice that this is the game, and I can shrink that down. And then this is a sort of console window, and that's basically exactly what it is. This is basically a user-added software project to create a game console, just like you'd see in a first-person shooter or a real-time strategy game or Skyrim or anything you've played recently. Probably has a console built into it. This allows you to alter various game features, and the way it works is through a series of plugins. And this is the current list that's installed. Now, we won't use all of these. They're just available to us. But some of them we'll touch on in depth. For example, workflow. We'll touch on GUI mechanisms and some of these other beautiful, beautiful tools that will allow us to really streamline our play experience. I'll use some of them to illustrate points on how the game works. I'll show you how, for example, stone levels are laid out in terms of how veins and clusters work. I'll explain how the caverns and the magma sea works, and I'll do it all with a utility that will let me effectively hide the fog of war temporarily. We'll look through the map and I'll explain everything as you see as you're going down, and then I'll put the fog of war back on and we'll play. And while my memory is good, it's not perfect, so I'm not going to remember a lot of the things that we see along the way. I'm simply going to do them so I can demonstrate for you how Dwarf Fortress is kind of working behind the scenes, because this is not really a introductory, you've never played Dwarf Fortress before tutorial. This is I can read hotkey descriptions on my own, I can read the wiki, how do I actually play this game kind of tutorial. I'll answer your questions as I go along, and I'll refer you frequently to the wiki if you're asking something that's in truly advanced depth. But I'm not going to explain every hotkey I press. I'll mention them in brief and move on. We'll cover the menus. We'll discuss how you change the settings and how you alter and how you play. But I'm not going to be reciting verbatim every key I hit and every button I push. The hotkeys actually have a display on screen. We're all a little better than that if you're here. Now I'm going to go ahead and hide. QuickFort is a separate utility that pops up down here. It's this little hammer here. I'm going to go ahead and hide QuickFort's command line Alt-H will hide that for me so I don't have to deal with that little window floating there. You can get it back the same way. But I don't want to deal with it right now. We're not really going to use QuickFort tonight anyway, so while I have it set up, I'm just going to hit exit. And then QuickFort is gone. We'll use QuickFort once we're actually playing the game, but we don't have any use for it tonight. Now let's talk world gen. When you go to create a world by default, create new world will let you go in and set various settings. And Advanced World Gen works the exact same way. The difference is that the basic World Gen lets you set these very basically in terms of wide categories, but that's it. It doesn't let you have a very fine detail of control over the various features of your game. And you really can only modify a small number of things, so there's really not a whole lot of control that you have. Advanced World Gen is a little different, and it might seem a little daunting at first, but the way it works is very simple. When the game loads initially, there are a collection of these items over here on the right. They're basically just parameter sets. Each one will generate a particular type of world. Pocket Island is smaller than Smaller Island, which is smaller than Small Island, and so on forth until you get to Large Island. And these are giant island continents like Australia. Large region is a large landmass that probably runs off the side of the map. So this would be like the traditional Middle Earth map where Tolkien only illustrates part of the continent and doesn't really show you everything. How you want to play, what you choose here will control what sort of world you get, and we will go into significant depth on these. The graphics scare me off. Well, that's the thing. We're not actually gonna play with ASCII. I use the Phoebus tile set. I use text will be text. My Dwarf Fortress is a lot prettier, in my opinion, than the default ASCII. But there's a downside. That means that because I've learned the tile set, I can't really grasp the game's vanilla ASCII character set as well, which kind of interferes with my ability to learn the game from other players who understand the ASCII symbols and can map the ASCII, for example, when they want to diagram something. I have to draw a picture. It interferes sometimes with my ability to understand what's funny in a Dwarf Fortress screenshot or to understand what someone's having a problem with if they're displaying a vanilla picture. I'm not going to evangelize particularly. I've tried several tile sets. I like the Phoebus tile set. It's what I'll be using when we play. But I like the tile set because it basically converts what is an ASCII Dwarf Fortress game into something like an old 8-bit Nintendo game where everything is represented with sprites instead of letters and characters, which makes the game immediately much more intuitive, in my opinion, for a new player. That's not to say there aren't advantages to learning the game in ASCII or that you shouldn't learn the game in ASCII, but if you've found yourself turned off by the game's default ASCII, what I'm going to demonstrate will actually show you how the game plays when it's a little more familiar, when it's a little more like something you may have played in the past. Now, parameter sets. These hotkeys over here control how parameter sets work, and my strong recommendation is don't modify the vanilla tile sets. There's a simple copy. Just hit C, copy the parameter set. Hey, I want to make a pocket region. Great. Hit copy. There's a new pocket region. Hit T, change the name. And then you can go into it and modify it. Hit E, and it literally has all of the parameter sets you can possibly modify. There are a ton of them. And we'll go through them, what I've changed for this embark that we're going to actually use to generate our world. So when I go into this, the first thing you'll notice is that I've turned on the seeds. These seeds allow me to dictate a specific world. If you set yours to use the same seeds and you use the same parameter sets I do, you'll get the same world gen I do. It's literally a key to the same world. Likewise, you can modify things like your embark points, and this one by default has an absurd number of embark points that's incorrect. Should be 1324, and somebody's modified it, and it wasn't me. And I know I need to change it, so we're going to go back and modify this to the vanilla because I don't want that many. I want the vanilla number of embark points. The end year, currently in Dwarf Fortress, the way the army arc is working is it doesn't. When the world starts and all the civilizations are created and the goblins and the dwarves go to war, the attacker wins. It doesn't matter who the attacker is. The attacker wins. So if the goblins start the war and there's one dwarven civilization and they immediately attack the mountain home in the year of 2, well, they just took the world over because the dwarves are now hereafter a conquered civilization and that's pretty much the end of it. So in this version, I'm currently running a short history. You can let your game go. It's not a guarantee that everybody gets attacked if you have a larger number of civilizations, if there's enough distance between them, if the history is long but not too long, then it doesn't necessarily end in defeat. But it's one of those things I like to just be able to guarantee for myself. So we'll turn the end year down so that our world will have a very short history. This does mean that all of the forgotten beasts will be there, and we won't have maybe, for example, the variety of necromancers and evil entities in the world that we would have with a longer history. We're going to turn off culling important historical features. We'll enable historical events. We're going to leave most of these set because I'm using the same world in terms of how it's actually generating here. This can't be correct. Wow. Well, maybe it is. Well, I guess we'll find out if it's the right one or not. Now, how these work once you get beyond that. Okay, so elevation, rainfall, temperature, drainage, volcanism, savagery. How do they work? It's very simple. It sounds really complicated, but it's not. Minimum and maximum are hard ranges. They literally bound the amount of distance between the low points and the high points in your world. They control what sort of environments you're going to see. They dictate how tall the mountains will be and how short the valleys will be and how deep the oceans get and so forth. The variances control how much these things are allowed to shift as you move around the map. A wide variance allows you to have an ocean directly adjacent to a mountain peak, for example, or a volcano directly adjacent to a swamp. A low variance would require a gradual shift. The mountains recede into smaller mountains, which recede into smaller mountains, which recede into foothills, which recede into smaller foothills, which recede into, and so on and so forth. A much slower decline in elevation. And that applies to all of these: rainfall, temperature, drainage. Now, the way they actually play together is best seen in the Dwarf Fortress Wiki. The article on surroundings is going to touch on savagery, for example. Savagery is the amount of danger, if you will, that's present in your embark. It's not really a hard and fast rule, but a highly savage area means you're going to see more things like giant animal men and giant animals instead of smaller varieties. So, for example, in a neutral environment here, the savagery controls whether it's calm, wilderness, or untamed wilds. The evil control, or the evil would move this down, and we would have evil would be sinister, haunted, terrifying in terms of its savagery. Now, savagery controls what you get. The article describes the difference between good, neutral, and evil quite well. Basically, evil, you're going to see undead. Good, you're going to see certain types of unique creatures. They're not necessarily easier, weaker, or to kill. And if you have a variety of terrain, you could see a mixture of them. For example, if you had an evil area adjacent to a good area, adjacent to an untamed wilds area, you could see unicorns fighting undead next to giant ant-men, for example. The wider variety of environments you contain within your embark will control what sort of animals there are to hunt, what sort of plants there are to pick, what sort of soil, metals, how deep the world is, where the magma is, you name it, the works. It will literally allow you to modify it in the terms of biomes. This little chart right here at the bottom of the biome article is how terrain works. So this is Advanced World Gen in a nutshell. This right here, yeah, every savagery tick corresponds directly to it. I don't know if it's an 80%. I like the humor. 80% chance of increased chance of being mauled by badger men upon embark. Yeah. To give you an idea, more savage embarks I've had giant birds arrive. I've literally had giant monkeys kill my Embark in the first 5 minutes of play because giant monkeys swarm me and try to steal my stuff. The dogs try to fight back. The dwarves I am enlist into an immediate militia get mauled by the giant monkeys. And I've literally lost an Embark in the first 5 minutes to giant monkeys, even when I've tried the same Embark a couple of times if I'm not careful. In fact, on one time on stream, I actually had an Embark killed by giant monkeys, and then I went back to the same Embark, and we never ended up getting the giant monkeys again. This will allow you to control in fine detail what sorts of terrain you end up with. If, for example, I set my maximum and minimum rain down really low, I could limit the world to being nothing but desert, wasteland, and badlands. Now, generally, you're going to want a wider variety because certain types of creatures, humans and elves, for example, will only appear in certain types of terrain. And so if you limit this too strictly, you're going to eliminate the ability either to have dwarves or to have elves or to have, humans. That'll affect your world. But you can bias the world gen towards certain types of terrain. If, for example, you wanted to play in a swamp, you know that you want to have a higher preponderance of low drainage, high rainfall terrain. And you know that it needs to be above elevation 100 and below elevation 300 to be a swamp. And temperature is glaciers, but that'll generally be at the poles. So, if I wanted to have a fortress in the middle of a swamp, a la Monty Python, there you go. That's how you bias the world gen. I want to make sure that I have a preponderance of low drainage and a preponderance of high rainfall. Now, our settings tonight, I'm not really going to mess with. Like I said, I'm using a set of settings I found. We're just going to run with it. So some of these are set much different than I normally would set them. Drainage, for example, is set right down to the middle. I suspect this has been tinkered with a little bit, maybe in Perfect World in the Embark. We'll double check that this is really the Embark I want when we get started. But the way you bias it then is usually not by modifying the savagery. Man, I really can't believe this is the way this was set, but maybe it was. Not by modifying the minimum and maximums, but by modifying the mesh size. Mesh size determines the weighted ranges of certain terrain features. So, for example, a smaller mesh size allows me to have a more finely grained terrain, the changes between these. So 0 to 20 represents the bottom 20% of those maximum and minimums I set at the top. So if I wanted to have low drainage be more common, what I would do is set a mesh size down small so that drainage could change more frequently, and then I would alter the frequency of this, and this is a relative frequency, to be higher. And so I would change it to be something like and what this would basically do is make the bottom 20% range 5 times as common as the 80 to 100 range, and 2.5 times as common as the 40 to 80 range. We would have absolutely none of anything in the 20 to 40 range. It would be non-existent. The terrain would literally have cutoffs where that range didn't appear or was swiftly moved through if in the case of erosion. So you, for example, could eliminate middle height, or you could eliminate mountains. You need to be careful when you eliminate mountains, though, because that means eliminating dwarves. And no dwarves means not a playable world unless you're going to adventure. So, since we want to be in dwarf mode, we have to have mountains. Now I need to back out because I want to make sure I don't save those changes. Make sure we don't modify the world. We'll cross our fingers and hope that this is really the world that I remember it being, because if it's not and I've named the wrong one and deleted the wrong one, then oops, and we're going to have a problem and I'll have to create the world live on stream! But, let's see, carrying on. So, generally what I would do when I'm modifying the mesh size is I set the mesh size small, and I delete these 20 to 40 and 60 to 80 ranges. So that gives me lows and mids and highs, but very little transition between them. So I get all the terrain types, but they don't spread out as much. My minimums and maximums I tend to leave where they are, with the exception of rainfall, which the minimum is normally 0, and I set to at least 1. Every place on Earth gets some sort of precipitation occasionally. It may not be much, but it gets some. Even if it's very, 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 very little. Poles determine whether you have temperature poles at north and or south. Mountain peaks and oceans, and this controls how many of them you'll have. If you set these minimums too high and you don't have enough terrain for mountains, for example, or you have a small map and you set the minimum peak number so high, it'll reject your world because it can't place enough. Likewise with oceans. Generally, I set those off. I set my minimum volcano number to something reasonable. I set my minimum mineral scarcity to something about 500. 100 is really low, and it makes minerals very common. Sometimes this will crowd out coal, for example. If you want to have coal on your map, it can sometimes be harder to find if you're crowding it out with metals. This affects beasts. So this has no beasts. Ugh. Oh, this isn't going to work at all. Oh, I didn't catch this. Plan B. We create the world live. Let's do it. So we'll copy our small region profile. We'll rename it. And we'll turn the seeds on so that you get the same world I do. And we'll modify these to be the numbers from 0 backwards to 1. I'll leave the embark points at default. I'll change the end year down to 2 because I want to avoid the possibility that the only dwarven civilization is taken over. We will not call important historical figures. I will reveal all historical events because I'm not planning to play in adventure mode, and so having them revealed to me as I explore is not important to me. And this gives my dwarves something to engrave on their walls from the start. If this is turned off, then only history that your civilization knows or all that your dwarves are aware of will actually be engraved on your walls. And things that haven't been known or are forgotten to your civilization simply aren't available to you. If you like hearing about the entire history of your world or certain events in World Gen or previous history, this is a good thing to leave off if you want to have them limited, or on if you want to be able to see everything. Minimum elevation I will turn up a little bit. We'll go up to about 45 or so. You don't want to set this too high or you eliminate all oceans on your map. You don't want to set it too low or your maximum too low or you'll eliminate mountain peaks. 400 is a mountain peak. 300 is the base level for to be a mountain. And you must have mountains on your map. You must have terrain between 300 and 400 in order to have dwarves at all. So if you want to be able to play Dwarf Fortress as a dwarf, you got to make sure you don't eliminate your dwarven terrain. X variance and Y variance, I'll leave it defaults. Minimum, like rainfall, like I said, I turn up. Even Antarctica and even the deserts get some rainfall occasionally. Minimum temperature, I set a little warmer, but not much. You'll still get glaciers. They just won't be as broad across your world. Maximum temperature, I leave right where it's at. Minimum drainage and maximum drainage, I don't touch. Minimum volcanism and maximum, I don't touch. Eliminating the minimum of 0 can make it more difficult to find flux or coal, for example. You might find marble, but you'll find it harder to find certain types of sedimentary rock if you set the minimum too high, which can eliminate coal and can eliminate certain types of flux stone that you might want to have to make steel. Minimum savagery, I'm going to turn this up a little bit because I want to minimize the low savagery areas of the world a little bit. Generally speaking, these things are split into categories of 30% of 100. So 0 to 33 is the low, and 34 to 65 is the mid, and 66 to 100 is the high. And if you wanted to eliminate high savagery, you could turn your maximum down. Keep in mind, if you eliminate all neutral, all low savagery areas, you might have trouble finding places for your dwarves to settle. I'm not sure if high savagery still eliminates the dwarves at all. Mesh sizes we'll set to 2 by 2, and as I've said before, we will eliminate those transition ranges from each of these. So we'll have a small mesh size, we'll have these transition ranges eliminated on everything. So we'll have highs and lows. There'll still be some transition, but it will be very, very minimized so that we'll tend to jag wildly from one terrain type to the next. That does result in a world that's not strictly speaking realistic if you're a geologist, but I'm not really a geologist, so I don't care. I don't care if there's any mountain peaks. I don't care if there's any oceans. I do care that there's mountains, but that's not the same thing as mountain peaks. Mountain peaks are really, really high peaks of elevation that are basically landmarks. I don't care if we have any of them. If our mountains never rise to that peak, I'm not going to notice. Minimum volcano number I will generally turn up a little bit. So we will turn this up to about, let's say 20 to start. We'll see if that works. Mineral scarcity I turn down a little bit. Oops, not that far. 500 is about where I want to be. We'll leave the cave numbers alone because those are kind of default for this world. We'll leave all these type categories alone because those are default for this world. We're not going to modify the amount of good or evil in our world for tonight. We're going to ignore these initial counts, but you want to watch final counts can eliminate your world and cause it to skip world gen, basically. So we want to make sure that those final counts, in my case, are set to none. I'm modifying my world gen weighting to get the world I want. Skeletons get smashed, generally, or you can wait for them to hopefully decay into usable bones. Erosion cycle count determines, how jaggy your mountains can be. Periodically eroding extreme cliffs determines whether you have vertical cliff faces, if you will. If you want to have those, turning off the periodic erosion can probably make them more common for you. Orographic precipitation and rain shadows. Dwarf Fortress literally tries to emulate a weather system in terms of determining terrain. So, for example, you run into a phenomenon in the real world where clouds approaching a mountain from one side leave their water on one side and then float over the other side dry, which means that over time, one side of the mountains tends to be greener and lusher than the other side if there's a prevailing wind pattern across it. That's a rain shadow, basically. So turning this on actually will make your world a little more realistic in terms of how rainfall works. The stream isn't showing up when you search for Dwarf Fortress. Really? Thank you, Twitch. Much love. I get all kinds of problems editing my stream status, so I'm not entirely surprised it doesn't show up. Doesn't surprise me. That's why I advertise on Reddit and not on Twitch. Oh, did you search under Dwarf Fortress or did you search under Slaves to Armok 2 Dwarf Fortress? Yeah, the full title is actually Slaves to Armok 2. Not that anybody calls it that. All right, maximum number of subregions will eliminate worlds that are too varied. So if you set that limit down or you alter your settings to allow more variance, but you don't increase the limit, this will tend to punt worlds that get too patchwork. The real world isn't really patchwork. It's got fairly wide swaths of the same type of overall terrain. Our settings are going to kind of jag back and forth a lot more frequently, and so this will allow our worlds to be accepted and not punt because they're so patchwork and so different. Cavern layers will affect whether you have underground plants. If you eliminate all cavern layers from your world, you have no underground plants because there are no caves in which to grow them. I generally would leave that at 3. You can turn it down to 1. I would not eliminate it ever. Openness and passage density probably don't have the same effects in version 40 that they did in the old version. I have yet to see a formalized topic on what they do in the new version. Because of the way that mushroom trees have been altered in the new version, the caverns are wide and open pretty much across the board, and there aren't really as many of the old labyrinth caves as there used to be. You're going to see large chunks of open caves when I show you the caverns the first time on stream. Water minimum, I always set this to at least 1. All of my caves have some form of water. It's not strictly speaking realistic. There are dry caves even in the real world, but it's a game, and frankly, I want to be able to make sure that at least every cave I run into has some sort of water in it. It may not be much, it may not be usable, it might be nothing more than a pond, but breaching the caverns will always allow me to grow plants, and I won't run into the situation where I have 3 dry caves and I can't do underground pasture spaces because there's no spores to grow anything. Magma layer I leave on, bottom layer I leave on. Z levels above ground and all of these above Z levels things here need to be discussed in a little more depth. Z levels above ground is literally the number of levels between ground level and the top of the world. You can build no higher. So if you want to build a really tall tower 100 levels above ground, then you've got to turn this up, or you've got to use one of the DF hack tools that modifies it on the fly, and I don't even know if that one works in the current version. So it's something to be aware of. If you want to build a 100-story tower, this is going to have to be modified at some point, either with DF hack or directly when you create the world. Each of these Z levels above deserves a special mention. Now, fair warning, folks, I don't restrain from spoilers here, so I'm going to go into some details here in the next couple of minutes. You might not want to pay attention to if you're, really want to avoid all spoilers on how the game works. But Z levels above layer 1 is the Z levels between ground level and the top of the first cave. Layer 2 is between the bottom of the first cave and the top of the second cave. Above 3 is between the bottom of the second cave and above the third cave. 4 is below the third cave and above the magma sea. 5 is the depth of the magma sea. And Z levels at bottom is how many levels of nasty, nasty things lurking at the bottom of the world if you dig too greedily and too deep that there are. Now, generally I like to give myself a little more room to play with. So, for example, I'll change the Z levels above 1 to something a little more like, 20. That gives me 20 levels before I hit a cave in which to build my fort without having to worry about building around a natural structure. It does make it easier to build a fort. It does make my forts a little more contiguous. And the reason I do that is not strictly speaking to make the game easier, but to cut down on the amount of travel my dwarves have to do. Unfortunately, one of the biggest hits that you're going to run into in terms of how your game plays over time, its frame rate, is going to be determined by how much travel your dwarves have to do to get from point A to point B. So the more spread out your fortress gets, the harder the hit on the frame rate. So we'll modify this a little bit to make it easier to build our fortress in a contiguous area, and then we'll go back later on and our whole fortress will be in one chunk of the world, basically. Now I do alter the number of levels between the caves. This allows a little bit. This gives me the ability to build small way stations on the way down within the stone layers between the caves. If, for example, I want to build sortie points that I can start from, barracks, for example, that are adjacent to the caves, I can do so on a layer that's not strictly speaking horizontally adjacent to a cave, but is instead vertically adjacent, and cut down again on pathfinding to the extent that I am able. I don't modify the number of layers in the magma sea, and I do tend to modify this a little higher. And I'll be honest, this isn't really about making the game easier. This is just that if the game goes long enough, this is the only way that you can control how much adamantine you can potentially get. See, adamantine spires rise up out of the bottom of the world from the dark place that we shall not mention, and they rise up to potentially intersect the third cave, the bottom level. And by expanding layer 4, I'm effectively creating a taller spire in my world if one of them rises up to near the level of the cave. So this potentially gives me more adamantine for later on in the game when we get to that point. Now, we're not going to touch on that until much, much later in the stream. And to be honest, it's something we're basically going to gloss over. We're not going to cover it in great depth even then, probably, unless we just don't have anything left. But if you're wanting to run your fortress to a natural conclusion at some point, allowing yourself an adequate supply of adamantine is a good thing to do. Increasing the magma sea doesn't really help you in any way. It just creates more space in the world because the magma sea refills automatically anyway, and increasing the number of levels just means there's more magma sea that has to refill. If you're really going to suck the magma out of the magma sea for some giant pumping operation that moves the magma sea to the surface, for example, then maybe you care about having multiple levels so it can refill as fast as possible, but probably not because your pumps aren't going to be down that far. And Z levels at the bottom just controls the number of levels in the dark place that shall not be named, and there's no reason to increase it beyond one. If you really want to build towers in the dark place, then you'll want to increase that, but otherwise, that just controls the amount of pathfinding frame rate hit we're going to take when we discover the dark place later on. Minimum and maximum natural cave size have probably a different effect than they did in V34. Theoretically, this controls the height of a cave vertically from bottom to top. So caves will always be at least 5 tall at some point. They'll be up to 25 stories tall. With the new mushroom trees, I'm not sure if this works in the same way it once did. Mountain caves and non-mountain caves are places where beasts can lair. We'll make them visible so we don't embark on one by accident. That saves us from discovering that the place we've chosen to be our new fort is actually a manticore lair, for example, or a dragon den. We'll allow tunnels to be able to show. We'll leave the civilizations alone. Now, these minimums right here at the end, this is where a lot of our rejections are going to occur. If you have these set too high and then you eliminate the type of terrain that they represent. If you want to learn Masterwork, you're beyond what I'm going to touch with Dwarf Fortress on stream. The truth of the matter is if you're modding your game, you've already moved beyond what I would consider a beginner phase. You understand what you're doing enough that you want to change it, and at that point, you're moving beyond the sort of things I'm going to cover here and on stream. You're effectively becoming an intermediate and advanced player, and you're beyond a tutorial at that point, unless you're just really wanting to see how somebody else plays. Masterwork, for those of you who aren't familiar, is basically a modification to Dwarf Fortress. It overhauls the game. It adds a bunch of civilizations, orcs, and mechanisms, and Lord knows what else. Some of which have new characteristics or special materials, or their trap avoids so that they can walk through your traps. If you're looking for more challenge or you want to streamline how the game plays in terms of clutter, Masterwork is something worth looking into, but it's kind of beyond the scope of our stream. So I'm not really going to go into depth. Likewise, I've seen other mods that change the game into a wasteland, for example. I remember seeing somebody doing a Fallout mod for Dwarf Fortress. The amount of things you can change with the tags really is just about unlimited, and once you add DF Hack and its custom coding into the mix, your control over Dwarf Fortress is extensive. Your ability to modify how the game plays and operates is fairly incredible, even at this early stage. What game there is in existence is hugely modifiable by you if you really want to go into that depth. Now, remember, I modified my game so that I had mesh sizes where the low, middle, and high levels of each thing were in balance. So I will have roughly the same amount of low elevation as I have high, and roughly the same amount of mid elevation as I have both. You'll notice, however, that this minimum is higher for the mid than it is for the low and the high. So right there, this is a gotcha. I've set my ranges, and then I've told it must have a minimum that doesn't comport with that. So this would create an endless series of world rejections and would end up with us just constantly rejecting every world that came out. And this is true for every one of these categories. Each one of the mids is a little higher than the lows and the highs, and so we'll need to set these down a little bit or eliminate them entirely in order to not reject our worlds because we don't have the right amount of volcanism or savagery of a particular amount. So this means that minimum number of mid, low, and high savagery will be in balance in my world. So since we changed our elevated ranges to force balance, it's probably a good idea that we allow it. And that's basically what we're doing here. And that's really it. That's all the settings. It's complicated when you first start it, but once you understand the biome chart that I showed you on the wiki, once you understand how this works, that controls 90% of what you're doing when you tinker in Advanced World Gen. For example, coal is more common in sedimentary rock, and sedimentary rock is more common in marshes and swamps and forests than it is in badlands and wastelands and so forth. So if you want to have sedimentary rock, you need to make sure that you're setting your volcanism low and your drainage to these types of terrains. You'll generally find it more commonly there. Um, Once you understand how to modify this, you can maximize the amount of terrain you'll get of a particular type. If you want to embark in a desert, if you want to embark in a swamp, if you want to embark in hills, these settings allow you to get there. If you want to embark next to the ocean, you know how to do it. If you want to embark in the mountains, you can do it. This allows you to modify World Gen in a general sense to your taste, to provide whatever sort of embark you like. And if you want more detail on what those go into, what a forest is, what types of these terrains there are, you can go into what the difference between a grassland, a savanna, and a shrubland is. For example, if I wanted to be sure that I got to work with valley herbs, I'd have to consider that, right there, looky, certain types of terrain only have certain types of critters. So, for example, in high savagery temperate grasslands, up here the giant badger. In evil temperate grasslands, I'll suddenly add harpies and ogres and so forth. This allows you to determine, hey, if you want to work with unicorns, you're going to need to have good terrain, but do you know whether it needs to be a forest or a grassland? Well, you can find out. You can go to the forests thing. You can go, hey, look, I want to look at broadleaf forest, and it turns out that broadleaf forests in good taigas appears unicorns, in good temperate forests appear satyrs and unicorns, and so on and so forth. That really allows you to control what sort of animals you're going to want to see, what sort of trees and plants they're going to grow there. All of that stuff is controlled by you in Advanced World Gen. Whereas when you do the Basic World Gen, you're kind of leaving it vague and unspecified. So if you want to have a higher degree of control, this allows you to get it. But it's not a perfect degree of control. If you want that level of control, you're going to need to sit down and figure out how to make Perfect World DF work for you. There are tutorials out there, and I confess I must just be terribly stupid because I just haven't made it work the way I want it to just yet. Maybe I'm lazy, maybe I'm dumb, but I'm not there yet. So, I tinker with Advanced World Gen, but you can modify Advanced World Gen even further with Perfect World and literally control it down to the tiniest little detail. So, we've gone ahead and we've set all of our settings the way we want them. We'll hit Escape, I'll hit F6 to save, and we'll go ahead and generate this world, and we'll see if it's got a useful embark spot. And right away, we get our music. Is this too loud, guys? Because I'm going to set this level tonight so I don't have to mess with it in the morning. Can you hear me, or is the music too loud? Now this is SoundSense I'm tinkering with, and basically SoundSense not only plays events, so for example, when I have piglets give birth, there's a sound that plays for that. So for example, one of these three would be chosen, and we'll get a pig grunt when we have piglets born. If someone dies because they've drowned, we'll get a nice Wilhelm scream. This will allow us to kind of keep an eye on what's going on in our fortress without modifying without looking through our announcements and reports as much. It'll allow us to hear exactly what's going on. And when I start my stream up tomorrow, we'll be using Simon Swerwer's Tankard Basher as our theme music when I start my stream. Personally, I love it. It's one of my favorites and that I've played from SoundSense. Okay, looking at our world. Now this is ASCII. When you use text will be text, the default World Gen screen here is displayed in ASCII. But these are swamps and forests, and you can kind of make out this is forests, these are hills, and there's a volcano, and here's an evil mountain, and here's a neutral mountain, and so on. But you don't really need to know what they are from this. This is just an overall picture of the world. Each one of these little up arrows is actually a volcano, so this is where all my volcanoes ended up in the world, pretty much. There's one right in this area, and I don't think I see any more, so this looks like all of them right there. We'll go ahead and accept that world, and we'll see if we can find a decent spot to embark. Now, we want to start playing, but before we do, I'm going to go ahead and poke at Legends mode for a moment, so as I promised I was going to kind of touch on that. Yeah, it is a pretty massive area. Basically, evil and good are assigned to regions, so it turns out that mountainous region was assigned evil, and so the whole region is evil, and that's the way it works. So that's probably going to be Goblin Haven right there. You know, we're going to have goblins out the wazoo down there. Now, there's not many historical figures in the world currently, but this will allow us to look through the historical figures, the places that have been founded. So, for example, towns and hamlets and forest retreats and fortresses and so forth. All of these things are here. Right here is a fortress, and this fortress is exactly 7 dwarves strong. In the year 1, these 7 dwarves began. It's not our 7, it's just another 7. But they haven't been conquered, so there's at least one other civilization of dwarves out there for us, which is good. So right there in the year 1 and the year 2, we haven't had the dwarven civilization conquered yet here. Looks like no big wars are going on. We'll start to see those going on in the background as civilizations bump into each other and the world progresses. But this will also tell you information about, and in a longer history, it'll have much more detail about male hydras. So, for example, this is a hydra. It's the only one of its kind, and who it's associated with, and it's where it's settled, and all of these civilizations and people that it's enemies with, and where it's laired at. And all of this does actually correspond to literal names and places and things in the world that is created when you generate a world. All of this ties together. All of these forgotten beasts and humans and dwarves and elves and all of those things literally have their histories created. We've shortened history so that we don't run into a particular problem, but you can run history out for years. Some people have even gotten it to go to the maximum, which is 10,000, but generally speaking, 10,000 will crash somewhere along the way, having run out of memory from having too many events or too many people in the world, or simply just not having enough RAM in your PC. The default 1,050 years will allow an extensive history with lots of civilization interplay and beasts attacking places. Short histories tend to have very little of interest that's gone on, which means your fortress is going to be one of the founding pillars of the world, if you will. And so how your fortress goes will be a significant factor in the world's history early on. Those sorts of things will be recorded. If your fortress falls to goblins at some point and you start another fortress in the same world, your engravers might engrave details about the fall of your fortress on the walls of your new fortress. You might get migrants from your fortress who survived the invasion, for example. I can show you Legend Viewer, I guess. So we'll dump out with the XML dump key here, and this may take it a minute. And we'll export the map and generation info. That'll include our world gen seed, so I can export it for later. Now, in the Dwarf Fortress folder, you will find a file if you've exported your world gen information. So here's the world gen, region 1, legends, region 1, world history, region 1, world map. So this will be familiar. This will be the exact map you saw earlier. That's a picture of the world. Give you a little more detail. World gen parameters is where our world gen seed is stored from the one we just created. So this is our world. This is it. And the seeds we've chosen to use, 0 through 1, and all of the settings we modified and changed, including how deep our world would be, and how much water would be in our caverns. All of those tags got modified for us when we were modifying them in the game. Sites and populations is literally a list of all the fortresses in the world. Now you can look at these things directly through these files, but you can also fire up the Dwarf Fortress Legends Viewer utility, Maybe. Somebody asked me to show it and it doesn't work. No! There we go. Okay, so now we have to tell it where to find the XML archive. And as you can tell, I haven't used this in a few versions. And once it's found all those, it will load in all of the civilizations and information, and it will allow you to see where they are. So here's information on the faint attic. Our dwarves come from the north. Um, right now, here's all of our people. In order to get full details, we need to make sure we import all of these other things. So, for example, world history is in the world history file. Sites and populations is in the sites and populations file. Map image is the map file. And legends XML is the legends file. And once you've loaded them all, then these won't, well, theoretically they shouldn't say, so there we go. Oh, this may not be up to date. Site conflicts, actually owned by somebody else. Squeezing Abbeys is dwarves. And it's probably the only dwarven civilization out there. Because our history is so short, very little has actually taken place in the world. No, I didn't realize it auto-found the others. That's good. I noticed it marked them as unknown. I didn't know if that was a missing thing that I forgot to load or if it was actually just the Legends viewer not knowing those things just yet. Yeah, getting a legendary dwarf because you've imported him from your old fortress is kind of a boon. Now this controls everything. This lists everything in the entire game, for example. So every site, every region, it's all here. Every event, you can search it. You can page through it. If you run a long history, this literally can become a master's course in procedurally generated history. Back and forth battles between a dwarf and goblin civilization for 10 or 50 years will have an intense number of events and number of people killed and their families mutilated. All that stuff's contained in the legends files in the history of the world. All of that stuff is recorded and tracked and can show up on the walls of your fort in engravings. And the legends viewer will allow you to kind of see it in detail in an easier way than you can within Dwarf Fortress. So see, for example, I can go into these things, but there's not any searching. There's not any really a good way to pick out things. And it involves a lot of going in and out of menus rather than having things cross-linked with hyperlinks. So the Legends viewer is a great way to explore that if you want to do it in great depth. Now, we're actually going to go in ahead and start playing. Adventurer mode is if I wanted to play in this world as an adventurer, which I do not. We're playing Dwarf Fortress. And here's our world. And you'll see a little blinking X. That's the area we're looking at. So these three maps represent progressively larger scale images of the world. And because our world is so small, the regional map and the world map are basically the same map. But if you have a large world, this map will be a superset of this map, which is a superset of that map. And basically, the X on this map would be where we are in the region, and then the X on this map would be where this local map was, and then that little embark square in the local map is where we will actually embark. So that gives you a kind of sense of scale. World to region to local to embark is a long way down from how big this world is. And these symbols represent the different civilizations that are here. So, for example, there's a dwarven civilization. There's elves here. Thinking this is elves or humans. I'm not sure which because I hate to say it, I'm terribly unfamiliar with the ASCII. Legends viewer would allow us to determine that, but I am not really too concerned. We're going to look hopefully for a place with both sand and clay and deep soil and shallow metals and deep metals. And how? Holy duty, we found it. This will work if it's reasonably flat. Close enough. Okay, so let's talk about what these different screens mean. So let's talk about why I'm going to go ahead and embark here. First off, DFHack will indicate for me that sand exists. That's not a vanilla feature. That's a nice, helpful feature that tells me there's sand here. The vanilla game will tell me that I have deep soil, clay, and all these different metals, and you can use the Site Finder down here at the bottom. The Site Finder will allow you to search for, find a desired location, and set, for example, what you want to find. I want a embark that's 5x5 with high savagery and medium elevation and low rain, and has a flux layer and has a river and has multiple or shallow and deep metals and has no soil. So this is a mountain, basically. That'll basically search your world for viable candidates and allow you to help find it. But generally speaking, it's a little easier to use some of the DFHack tools that are included for you with the starter pack. In particular, if I'm looking for sand, and I love sand, then I'm looking for it right here, and that lets me find it very easily. Clay, same thing. I don't know what type of clay this is from here. It just tells me if there's sand and clay, so I can explore both of those industries on stream for you guys, which would be nice. These other things sort of tell me details about the biome I'm in. So this is a temperate freshwater swamp, so right off the bat I know I'm in a swamp. It potentially freezes in the winter. It's warm, so it probably doesn't freeze for very long if it does. Heavily forested means there's lots of trees. Other vegetation thick means there's lots of shrubs to pick berries from. And the surroundings being wilderness tells me that this is a neutral, medium savagery area. It means it's neither good nor evil, and it's not particularly savage. So this is a relatively benign area in which to embark. It's maybe not the easiest, but it's got a good abundance of resources, ready access to water, it's reasonably flat, heavy forestation for easy access to wood. This is a pretty good embark for a new player to start on. So this is what I'm going to go with. And we'll come back to this area at the tip of this river here in a minute. But you can embark in all sorts of different areas. If you want to embark in the mountains, you can embark there. If you want to embark on an island in the middle of the ocean, you can do it. If you want to embark in a glacier, and I've done that on stream in the past, you can certainly do so. You can embark down here in this corner way down here. That's ocean. Let's see, do we have ocean on both sides? Yeah, and then tundra right here. So it doesn't look like any glacier down here. I set my world too warm to get glaciers, just tundra. Sad, unfortunately, this world has no glaciers. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo. In fact, on stream during a Glacier Fort, I actually ran bedrooms carved out of ice for all my dwarves. The Ice Hotel in Dwarf Fortress. The surroundings of these different areas will tell you what sorts of things you can encounter in them, and that information is in the biomes and surroundings articles on the wiki. I won't go into the difference between shrublands and grasslands and forests, but it's pretty much what you can imagine. Grasslands have fewer trees, deserts have fewer still. Large rivers have big chunks of water moving through them that you'll have to deal with or work around. Embarking on the shore of an ocean means you can fish for whale, or you can try to trap whales. Embarking in evil terrain like these mountains down here would mean that we would have to deal with undead. Embarking in badlands may mean that our area is rocky and with few plants to deal with. So this sand desert, for example, is not only freezing cold, but has no trees and no other vegetation, and is in moderate surroundings. There's no clay here. There's only one level of soil because it's little soil instead of deep soil, whereas deep soil will be multiple levels. Little soil is probably only one. Now, this is some nice general information on our embark, but DFHack can do better. The tool we'll use is called Prospect. Prospect will give us a readout on what we can expect to find in terms of material resources on site when we embark. Now, before embark, it's just an estimate, but it's a pretty good estimate. So we'll use Prospect all to get a listing of all of our resources. Now, this isn't really everything because it's pre-embark, and as it warns you, it's just an estimate. There's potentially some fuzz. There might be a different amount of some of these things, but What this will tell me is what sorts of soils and sands and materials I can expect to encounter. So, for example, in this site, we will have fire clay, which is the most valuable type of clay. We'll have yellow sand, which is a sand. Yay! So I have both clay and the most valuable type of clay and sand. We have marble, which is a type of flux stone for making steel. We have hematite, which is an ore of iron. We'll use that for making steel. We have a variety of other materials as well. This site in particular has an enormous quantity of magnetite, which is an iron ore. So we're going to be drowning in iron ore. We'll have plenty of flux to make steel. We'll have clay. We'll have sand. This is going to be a well-defended fortress if we can keep it. We'll also have gold and silver. Galena is an ore of both silver and lead. Tetrahedrite is an ore of silver and copper. So we'll have gold, silver, and copper to make valuable crafts out of or to ornament our materials with. Gems, if you care about having a particular type of gem, the more common types of gems can kind of be found. It'll tell you what you're going to see. Once you get down to the bottom of the gems, it starts to get a little more inaccurate. It's very difficult for Prospect to determine if you have certain very rare types of gems like diamonds, because they're very, very, very uncommon to find. And they occur in such small numbers that Prospect just can't estimate them accurately in most cases. Vein stones here, these are non-ore stones that we would encounter. Mica is magma safe, as is orthoclase. Orthoclase, I know, is from experience is a yellow stone. Pitch blende, for laughs, is an ore of uranium. This is yellow cake, basically. If it's refined, it becomes uranium. It's not radioactive in Dwarf Fortress, thankfully, so you don't have to deal with your dwarves being irradiated. Likewise, cobaltite, which is an ore of cobalt, is actually potentially dangerous to mine, but your dwarves can mine it out just fine without suffering the consequences of cobalt poisoning. And that gives us an idea of what we're going to encounter once we embark. Now, not pictured on the pre-embark are what sorts of plants you'll get. Prospect doesn't know at this point what sort of plants we'll see. Prospect will become a significantly greater chunk more accurate once we embark. Now, this does tell me deep soil, so let's talk about the soil. You'll see little, some, deep, very deep. And basically that represents the number of layers of soil you'll get. Deep soil means that we'll have 3 layers, and as you see, silty, fire, sand. Very deep soil is like between 4 and 8, and there's nothing more than that. A really soil-heavy area could go larger than 4, I've been told. I've never seen one, but it's possible. Little soil means there's at least 1 level, but probably no more. And some soil means there's 2, so 1, 2, 3, 4 plus are the gradations of soil. Soil is useful because it's easy to build pasture spaces and farms in, so for a new player, soil is easy. It's not the only way to farm. You can irrigate stone and farm on plots you've created yourself that way. It's just an easy way to get started early. So for a new player, starting off in some place with soil is a useful tool. But I've embarked in places with no soil, and you can farm in the caverns. I've embarked in glaciers and deserts and places that are completely inhospitable. Not evil terrain yet, because there was a bug in the last version, and I haven't done it yet in version 40. In version 34, evil terrain would resurrect the undead, but the undead were basically not permanently killable except by certain means, and it took a lot of the fun out of evil terrain as far as I was concerned. At some point, we'll probably have to stream an evil embark, but not this time. This time out of the gate, we're looking to introduce new players, and evil terrain is something I would strongly recommend that you avoid if you are a new player. It's inhospitable, to say the least. Now, we will kind of shrink our embark a little bit. I don't need it to be quite as big as it was. 5x5, the bigger your embark gets, the amount of space that's involved, the deeper your fortress gets, the wider it spreads out, the greater the frame rate hit overall. So the more stone we include, the more area we include for our fort, then the bigger the frame rate we're going to take as we go along. So we do want to kind of mitigate that a little bit. If you're running a modern PC with a fairly good core, you're running a really beastly single core processor, for example, maybe, you might be able to get away with a bigger embark. But 5x5, in my experience, is a really big embark for me, and I won't really even use all of that space. It's mostly just extra surface terrain and extra cavern terrain that mostly goes to waste in mine. So we'll shrink it down a little bit. We'll do a 4x4. That'll mitigate some of the frame rate hit. It'll allow us to have ample space. The default is 3x3. That's still plenty of space to build a fortress. And you can, with certain tools, embark in much, much smaller terrains. You'll notice that down there at the bottom it says that Nano Embark is enabled. That's a DF hack tool that will literally allow me to shrink my embark down to a 1x1 square. If I want to play a really micro fort, I could do that. Now, we're going to tab through several screens. As I hit tab, it cycles through various maps and legends over here and information, and I'm going to kind of explain what each of these means. The default tells you about the embark and surroundings, and hitting tab will tell you about your neighbors. If you have neighbors of a certain type, you can expect them to visit your fortress and trade with you or attempt to pillage you. So dwarves will trade with us, elves and humans will trade with us, goblins will come and make mayhem. So this also will tell you if you're already at war with somebody. So, for example, it's possible to embark in a world and find out that the dwarven civilization has gone to war with the elves, the humans, and the goblins. And if you embark in such a world, it's from one of those civilizations, then it's very possible that you're going to see an attack very early on by armed and trained bands of soldiers coming to wipe you out because your civilization is already at war before you even get started. Now, theoretically, in older versions, it was reported you could trade with the goblins. I have never seen this, but I can't rule it out. I wouldn't count on it. If there are multiple civilizations you can choose to embark as, it's possible that some will or will not have certain types of materials. Embarking in your civilization, changing your civilization may change who you're at war with. For example, if there's two dwarven civilizations, one might be at war with the elves, and the other might be at war with the humans, or one might be at war with everybody, and the other at war with no one. The civilizations will control some of the features of what's available to you at embark, in terms of pieces of armor, or whether your civilization has iron will determine whether you have iron anvils. So changing which civilization you embark can actually change, even on the same map, what sort of game you're going to start out with. Now, elevation, cliff indicator kind of go hand in hand to determine the topography of your map. Elevation, relative elevation, will determine what is high versus low in your map, and in our case the elevation is uniform across the entire surface of our map, so this will be flat. And cliffiness, the amount of cliffs, determines how quickly terrain shifts from area to area. So a high number here, or a star, would indicate that it's a mountain, for example, and it's going up very quickly. A lower number, like 0, would mean it was flat, and low small numbers would mean that there's a gradual slope to the terrain between areas. So in this case, we're embarking in a flat area with no cliffs. You'll see the river moving through the area. And then we have, it turns out, 2 biomes in this area. So if you look at the bottom, there's an F key down there, F1, F2. And what that basically means is this chunk of this local map is Biome 1, a temperate freshwater swamp with those characteristics. And Biome 2 is this biome. Now, it's possible for these to be different. As it turns out, they look like they're pretty much extensions of one another, so we're not going to have a real variation between the 2 biomes. But I could embark, for example, at the border between a Badlands and an evil area and a good area and a savage area, and I could get a really wide variety of embark characteristics on the same map. I could be dealing with undead right alongside trying to trap unicorns for my meat. Whether you want to have that sort of variation is up to you, and the F keys will allow you to cycle through what those terrains are. So in this case, we'll be embarking adjacent to the stream. We'll be embarking in a swamp. This looks like a good spot, near as I can tell. So we're going to go ahead and we'll embark here. Now, I turned on the embark warning, so it warns me in case I accidentally hit the E key while I'm talking. And then I'll hit enter. And then we get to determine our embark profile. And I could use one of these embark profiles and embark right away. But we're going to create one custom because I'll kind of go through what goes into my embarks and why I take what I take. So we'll prepare for the journey carefully. And this brings up a list of our dwarves. Here are our starting 7. Each one can have up to 10 points in skills. And these are the skills they can get. And there's a huge list over there. A page and some long. Okay? As I add more skills to a dwarf, So example, I make this guy into a miner. His skill goes up. The number of skill points he can take goes down with each skill I give him, each increase in skill I give him, and each skill level I buy costs more embark points. So yeah, folks are talking about the difference between flat versus hilly embarks. Yes, a flat embark is wonderful for being able to see your surface level on one floor and the floor above surface on one floor. If you're an urban or suburban dweller, you're probably already thinking in flat terrain and you didn't even realize it. If you're from the mountains though, or you want to have the ability to dig straight into the side of a mountain and dig a fortress that way, a traditional dwarf fort, then you'll want to embark somewhere where there's some hill terrain that you can actually dig into. Nope, we confirmed iron. Not only iron, but flux. And not only iron, but magnetite clusters. So we have more iron than we know what to do with. Sand, fire clay, iron, flux. This is going to be a hell of an embark for a newbie. Okay, so typically you'll notice embark points. Some of the embark points, when you prepare carefully, I'll hit tab here, are already spent on all this equipment. The first thing I do is go through and get rid of all of it. Gone. I don't want any of it. I'll pick it all out back later the way I want it, and I'll explain what I'm doing. So we'll clear all of those embark points out. You'll notice I now have a lot more embark points than I did before down there at the bottom. So when I hit tab and I get rid of this one skill I bought, now I'm at my 1324, which is my embark point cap that you picked out when you created the world to begin with. That's the default. Now, what I'll bring with me, I'll get into in a minute, but let's talk about skills for a moment for my dwarves. There are no dumb questions. If you came, yeah, it's a swamp actually, so it's heavily forested. There's more wood to burn than I'm ever going to need for coal. We could make a steel industry just off the logs if we want. We'll have to deal with the elves if we do, but we can do that if we really want to. Or we can carefully ration our tree cutting to only produce the amount of fuel that we need to make just the amount of iron, or just the amount of steel that we need to make just the amount of armor and weapons we need to equip our military and so forth. We'll try to be judicious. I generally try to keep peace with the elves because I like the chance to import desert scorpions and giant eagles, but your mileage may vary. Hey man, a breeding pair of giant desert scorpions. That's all I'm going to say. A breeding pair of giant eagles. Not all I'm going to say. Modify your raws, make them trainable for war, and now you have giant war scorpions. No way, man. Give it a try first. If you really want to fight them, you can. But